There was quite a controversy in Lake George this summer over plans to use a relatively new chemical called Procelacor to kill off Eurasian water milfoil in the lake. After getting state DEC and APA approval, the Lake George Park Commission went ahead with the treatment, despite some very vocal opposition. And Zack Matson is an environmental reporter for the Adirondack Explorer. Welcome, it's nice to have you here.
Thank you, good to be here.
This is a story you've been focusing on for several months now, the Lake George Park Commission getting approval from state regulators and the Adirondack Park Agency to use that herbicide. What exactly is Procelacor and why is it so controversial?
You know, residents who live in these bays got really upset. They said, we don't know enough and we don't think using a chemical in the lake is the right move. And so they sort of took every tool they had at their disposal to fight back against this plan. They challenged it in courts. They organized, a massive PR campaign, and they got a lot of support within the community that they don't want to see. No drop of Procelacor in Lake George.
And ultimately, though, they failed. They weren't able to stop it from happening. It did happen about a month or so ago?
Yeah, it happened at the end of June. There's sort of this idea that the best time to use this herbicide is by the end of June when this plant has come out, but a lot of the other native plants haven't come out. And they've been trying for a couple of years, the Lake George Park Commission, to get approval, and it's been challenged in the courts. Initially, a couple of years ago, a judge did side with the Lake George Association that there hadn't been a sort of enough analysis of this product. That was ultimately overturned. And so when that same judge had basically the LGA asking for him to block it again, he said, my hands are tied. The courts above me have ruled and I'm going to let it go. So that happened really like a day or two before this sort of 5-day window where they had to get it in and dropped it in the lake, and it's in there now.
So about a month later, they went back to follow up to see how it worked, and you went along with them.
Yeah, I tagged along about a month later when they went in with divers to sort of take a look at how it was doing. And at that time, I put on some snorkeling gear and took a look myself. And at that time, there was a lot of dead milfoil, and some of the milfoil you couldn't even see anymore. You could see sort of browned out stems laying on the bottom of the lake, and there were native plants in there. And so that that was what they were hoping to see. The opponents of the plan say, they expected that to work, but they don't know what else is happening. Is it, causing other problems that we aren't seeing yet? Is it causing problems that we may not see for, years and years and years?
Is this the first time they've ever used not just this particular chemical, but a chemical to treat Eurasian water milfoil in the lake?
Yeah, that was part of this, is that I think some of the opponents felt like there was a crossing of some kind of Rubicon, that there had never been chemical management of invasives on Lake George before, and that was somehow, very special about Lake George, that all over the country that we're dropping chemicals in the lakes left and right, and that hadn't happened in Lake George. So I think there is this sort of contingent of people who say, no chemicals anywhere, and they point to this long history of regret over the use of different herbicides and pesticides, and that goes back many years to DDT, and but even now there's always sort of emerging science about the effect that widespread agricultural herbicides have on pollinator populations or create higher incidences of cancer. And so the proponents say those are apple and oranges comparison, and that this product is safe. There are no no one's found any safety concerns, or there are no restrictions that you can drink the water as this product is being used in the lake. But that wasn't sort of enough to satisfy some of the concerns of people, and people did feel like this was crossing some new threshold.
Procelacor has been used in the Adirondacks, in waterways in the Adirondacks before. The APA has approved it before.
Right, yeah, APA first approved Procelacor in Minerva Lake in 2020. Since then, it's been approved in about 8 lakes throughout the park, sort of really every corner of the park, in Horseshoe Pond in the northern Adirondacks, all the way down to Lake Luzerne in the southern Adirondack, Caroga Lake, Brant Lake, Paradox Lake. So yeah, it's been used more widely. And there's a lot of interest because this milfoil problem has been, a real headache for scores and scores of lakes throughout the park.
It was just approved in 2018. If it's being used not only in New York and the Adirondacks, but across the country, are there any other areas of the country where it's been used and there have been problems?
They haven't pointed to many examples where there have been studies. I mean, part of it is that it's still pretty early and that they're saying, well, why don't we wait until, these other communities use it and have, multiple years to understand its effects.
Is the Park Commission planning to do more bays? Is it going to go back to the state and to the APA next year to seek approval to do more sites?
Yeah, and I've asked, the Park Commission's Executive Director, Dave Wick, about this, and he says that they would only expect to use it in bays where they've had, heavy milfoil problems, persistent milfoil problems that haven't responded well to this hand harvesting technique. And he estimated maybe, 10 or 12 of these bays throughout the park that he feels like would be good candidates for Priscilla-core. In terms of the next steps, there are 3 bays that they're looking at as would maybe be the next in line. He says he's not sure yet if he's going to go for a permit, next year or wait longer, learn more from some of the water quality analysis that's being done and, see what sort of the public reaction at that time is.
You have a number of follow-up reports that are on your website. The September issue is out, and you have a story about Lake Champlain and the revival of the lake trout in Lake Champlain.
Really in the last 10 years, they've started to see a takeoff of, wild lake-born lake trout sort of thriving in the lake. And so, these fish restoration projects don't often, end in success, but that's sort of what it seems like we're seeing in Lake Champlain.
There was concern for a number of years about sea lamprey, and you can see many of the lake trout were wounded, but they've been able to overcome that. They've treated the sea lamprey with lampricide, and you worked with a longtime UVM scientist, Ellen Marsen, who has done research on Lake Champlain for decades now.
It's kind of a big capstone to Ellen's career. She came to the Lake Champlain area around 1996, and at that time they had been stocking lake trout in Lake Champlain, over tens of thousands of lake trout every year. And these fish were surviving, they were reproducing, they were hatching, but no one was finding any evidence that these fish who were born in the lake were surviving their first winter. And she sort of described to me, watching these baby fish sort of swim off into a dark void, and they were never seen again. And in 2015, Ellen and colleagues, found these wild fish swimming in the lake, and this was sort of this like voila moment that something had happened, that the wild fish were surviving and taking off. And it's still sort of a mystery what happened. They do this massive effort to treat the lamprey, and so they've been keeping them in check. The other invasive fish that are in there, an alewife, invaded in 2003 and has really sort of overturned the whole hierarchy of fish in the lake, and is now the most prevalent sort of forage fish that fish like lake trout feed on. Ellen and a postdoc student who sort of modeled out the food web, theorized that it's possible that the alewife that have harmed lake trout in the Great Lakes might actually be, this energy boost for lake trout in Lake Champlain, and possibly jump-started this restoration and recovery.
Because they're a food source.
As a major food source, yeah.
Along with Zack's story, the new issue of Adirondack Explorer has the latest installment of Tim Rowland's Jobs 2.0 series. It looks at the future of employment in the Adirondack Park and how independent entrepreneurs are feeling needs in the park. And Arietta Hallock talks to the graduating class at Indian Lake Central School, all 4 of them. Her story on the school's smallest class ever looks at the growing trend across rural New York of schools with declining enrollment. You'll find those stories and more in the September-October issue of Adirondack Explorer.